Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to wait a few moments for folks to join us. Welcome. If you want to let us know where you're tuning in from in the Q&A, we always love to see where folks are. Ooh, okay, New York, San Jose, California, Baltimore, all over the place. This is great. Thank you all. Cleveland, Boston. So fun to see. Well, thank you all so much for joining. My name is Emma, and I just want to thank you all for coming to tonight's webinar, Science of Reading Centers. Our executive director will be walking through best practices for SoR centers-based instruction and activities to help you get the most out of instructional time. Again, thank you all for putting in the Q&A where you're tuning in from. I see someone from Hungary. That's cool. And Indiana, Baltimore, Virginia. Amazing. Okay, so before we get started, I just want to take a moment to talk to you about some of the upcoming trainings and events that we have going on. Alrighty. As a reminder, you can earn CEs towards IDA, MSLEC, ALTA, and other accrediting organizations by attending our workshops. Okay, so first up, we have Kendore Kingdom Part 1. This is the best way to learn our systematic multisensory approach to teaching reading, spelling, writing, and more. We have an online cohort starting next week. It's great. It's a really nice way to finish your day, get in extra information. So that will begin September 16th. And next week, Jennifer is going to be in Indiana, doing a part 1. I know I saw some Indiana folks in the Q&A, so we'll be excited to see you all. We also have a Kendore Wordplay workshop coming up online in November. Kendore Wordplay covers, the skills necessary to teach vocabulary, including etymology, morphology, and more. If you are a word nerd like we are, this is a really great workshop to start with. In addition, we will be hosting another virtual dyslexia simulation this year. This time it will be hosted on December 2nd, and the simulation will shed light on the difficulties a struggling reader with dyslexia faces. So it's a great event to attend to understand how we can, best assist students. You can register for all of those events by visiting our online store or bit.ly Kendore Workshops. And one more thing, if you've attended our webinars before, you know that often we host a Kendore Learning instructional community. This is an interactive workshop that allows you to dive deeper into the topic mentioned. Jennifer walks participants through activities, answers questions. For this particular click, attendees also received physical materials for instruction, and you'll see some of those during tonight's presentation. So our click, Science of Reading Centers click, is this Thursday at 7 p.m. Again, you can find out more information by visiting our online store. I'll also put the link to register in the chat. And finally, if you're curious about what we do, great place to start would be our website. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome our speaker for tonight, Executive Director Jennifer Hasser.
Hello, hello. How's it going? Emma's been on vacation, so I'm very excited to see her. So thank you everybody for joining us. We're going to go into some of the research behind centers and what people say about them and all of that. And then we're going to talk about how we can do them in a way that is beneficial to all of our students. Okay. And then we'll have a Q&A where you can ask me. So any questions that you have about them, I have done them many, many different ways over the last 30 years of teaching, I guess. So I can, answer, quite a few of them, the questions that you have. I am gearing this a little bit towards the lower grades, but I've taught high school, so I can, during the Q&A, we can talk about a lot of different ways to make sure that, we are maximizing our learning time with our students. So let's get started. And let me pull up this presentation to share with you guys. I was going to be monitoring the Q&A, and then I have learned that I can't look at it while I'm talking or I won't finish my presentation, but I am happy to answer questions, and I typically stay late. So if anybody has the questions, you can put them in there. If they're, questions Emma can answer, she'll answer them as we go. Okay. So as we move through this, basically what are learning centers, right? So people call them a bunch of different names, right? So our independent learning activities, our seat work, or stations, or um, you know, lots of different, options. People talk about how they're, you know, good for the kids, they're engaging, they're student centered. Um, People talk about them all the time, but what really is the research behind them? Right. So first we have to say, like, what are we aiming to do? We want to have our students be more independent. We want to differentiate our instruction. We want the kids to have hands-on learning opportunities and to be engaged. Um, and we kind of feel like we need to have them sometimes. Actually, sometimes they're mandated. I worked in a school where if the principal found you doing whole group instruction, you got in trouble. That it was actually needed to be in a center, format. I think that was a little, extreme personally, but you know, we figured it out. So what the research really tells us is that when we think seat work or centers or stations, when we use them incorrectly, there's kids are spending 70% of their educational time on their own, right? It goes all the way back to 1978, the studies, and um, we have studies from 2005, we have studies from 2012, and they're basically showing that the way that we are doing our centers is not the best way that we could be using our academic time, right? So more teacher time definitely translated in all of these studies into more learning time, right? And more time spent, on that individual seat work or center time, the less learning occurred, right? So we have to really keep that in mind when we're thinking about what we're putting in our centers, how we're dividing our kids into groups for our centers. Are we actually picking the things that are going to get us the best outcome? Because sometimes creating all these centers takes a long time and it's effortful. And then we find out we're not even really maximizing our learning. So we're going to talk about how we can do that tonight, how we can, say, okay, we don't want our kids not getting, the best out of our educational time, right? Um, our students engaged during independent work. So basically, studies show that they are less engaged. And seat work tends to be negatively correlated to learning outcomes. And our top readers will perform well, but our poor readers fall behind. And we are always struggling to try to meet the needs of all of our kids because the way that schools are designed now, we are supposed to put, 25 to 30 kids in a room and then meet all of their individual needs. And as one person, with 30 kids, that's not an easy task, right? How are we going to um, customize for that many different groups? And I've been working with schools where we have some classrooms where the kids are 4 or 5 grade levels above the lowest kids in the group. And then I just recently was working with a classroom where there was no one in the middle. It was super high and super low and nobody in between. So I hear these things all the time. So how do we meet the needs of all of these different types of learners that are sitting next to each other in the classroom. So do we need to abandon our learning centers? Not necessarily, but we need to be more strategic in our implementation of them. And we need to minimize purely independent work, because if our kids are low, what are they going to be teaching themselves in purely independent work? If I was sitting around by myself and I said, "Oh, Jennifer, you should teach yourself something new today." If I don't know it, I can't teach it to myself. So we have to make sure that what they're doing isn't busy work, and it's not that hard to pick good quality things, and we're going to talk about how we can do that during that time, because we do need to spend some time with our low kids. We do need to help our higher kids maximize their time with us. So what do we need to do? One, we need to make sure that we are integrating teacher interaction, right? It can't be that they are completely independent during this time and I'm grading papers, right? I can't be off, doing something other than, either, and I'm going to show you a couple different models, working directly with my kids, or being kind of a floater and monitoring what's going on at each of these, different, tables or activities, or however your room can set it up. But we can also incorporate cooperative learning where the kids are working together, because I can't teach myself something new, but perhaps my teammate, table mate can teach me something new. We can ask each other what we think about things. We can practice our reading together. Um, and we need to focus on applied learning. So one of my, kind of biggest pet peeves, if anyone has ever taken a training from me, is that rule of the week does not work, right? When we teach something and then on Friday we do a test, most of our kids do well. And if they do well, we think we've taught that. But then by the next week, they aren't applying it anymore. They aren't using the words that we taught, or the spelling rule that we taught in their writing. So even though we've learned it, there's no application. And in order to have that kind of application in their everyday learning, it has to be internalized. And in order for something to be internalized, it has to be repeated enough to where it becomes overlearned. And that's where I think we can really get the most bang for our buck from centers, is using the centers to get that repetitive practice and apply what we've taught them, so that it can start to internalize, so that we start to see a progression of skills that build on one another, not this, I've memorized it, I've regurgitated it, I forgot it, right? Um, and then we can monitor it and adjust. And as kids are, as we're progressing through our curriculum, as they're learning new skills, we can say, okay, I'm seeing that I've taught all these words, but I look at a writing sample and there's no transfer whatsoever. So I'm going to start pulling some of these, errors that I'm seeing, and those could be the focus of some of the different centers. And they're going to be different kids that struggle with different words and different concepts that have already been taught. And so how do we group those into appropriate groupings, right? And we can always adjust. I mean, I've put kids into groups and then I was like, ooh, that was a dangerous combination. Those two shouldn't be sitting next to each other, right? So maybe it's behavior, maybe it's, as they, when you move kids from a big group into a small group, then their differences become, amplified, right? So they seem on paper like they're similar, but then when we put them into a group together, we realize one of them is way lower, way higher than the rest of them. And we can easily adjust that. We can move them into a different grouping. We can move them up, we can move them down. And that's, no big deal. It doesn't have to be, people think it has to be after a benchmark, or we have to, a classroom should be fluid for being able to move them around. Um, if we have pull-out intervention groups, that would be a little bit more of a, let's progress monitor, let's see which kids move out of intervention or into intervention, and that would be a little bit more rigid than what I'm talking about. I'm talking about in a classroom, daily life, moving kids around from different activities. Okay, so how do we make these centers effective? Okay, so the first step is we need to assess. Now, it doesn't have to be formal, but it can be a formal assessment. It could be a standardized assessment. It could be a curriculum-based assessment. It could be writing samples. It could be a spelling test. It could be teacher observation, right? So if I am working with kids and I'm not taking direct data, but I can see that a lot of kids are having reversals in their handwriting, that can just be teacher observation. And so, maybe this week we're going to do, a station or a center that, works on letter reversals, because letter reversals are most often lack of repetition, right? Because um, most kids who have like a B and D reversal, they know that they're two different letters and they know that they're two different sounds, but they have a hard time retaining that, right? So they don't say my mom and Bab. They know that it's my mom and dad, but when it comes time to write it, they can't remember which one's which. So that means they need more exposure, they need more practice, um, with those sounds, and those symbols that go along with those, right? So that they are pairing them correctly. And that could be just through teacher observation, right? Just, randomly. Writing samples, if we see certain types of errors, for kids, like I had a um, group of kids where they were writing like dis and dat instead of this and that. And that can be dialectical, right? So if they say that in at home, and but where the d and the th, right, are formed or both in the front of your mouth, you can spend time on discriminating between those things. There's just lots of different ways you can do it. If we're seeing that we're having trouble with blending, we did some, CVC blending measures and they're not blending correctly. So we know we have to target that. Um, all of these things we can look at and then group accordingly. So if I had kids that need blending practice, but they really can't hold three sounds, maybe I'm going to put them and just do vowel consonant blending, because continuous blending would be really great for them. And all vowels are continuous sounds. You can keep saying them till you run out of air. And so starting with a vowel into a consonant is a good way to make sure you're doing a continuous blending activity. And then some kids are ready for CVC, right? But in that way we can get, some type of mastery on VC and then give them CVC, or we have some kids with CVC, but they just have, a few errors, but they can handle a lot more vowel sounds, a lot, more in their card decks for those activities. High frequency words, especially ones that we would consider to be, irregular, or I call them discovery words, because almost all words have a reason, that is pretty reasonable that we can learn, and a pattern that we can learn, but it may not be something that we're doing at their age, right? It might be a little bit much to go into detail depending on their age. But vocabulary and fluency, all of these things can be worked on at different levels, all of them, right? So if some kids are still working on of for a high frequency word, there could be another student that's working on though, right? Which is a little bit more difficult to hold on to, a little bit longer, more letters. So we can pick and choose which ones we're going to use, in different groupings. Then the next thing is we want to target, right? We want to say, okay, here's what I found. Here's how I can possibly group these kids, and here's how I'm going to target um, those deficit areas, right? So now I'm like, we've got a group, we've got a group of what they can do and how well they do. And then we can make sure that we only use activities that students have been taught. So if they haven't been taught whole group or in a small group to do the activity, it should never be an independent activity, right? It should be something that we know for certain they know the, routine of that activity, and then we can change the content of the activity. So the activity has been mastered, but the content hasn't been mastered. We can change out different content as long as they understand exactly the routine of what that activity entails. And that's how you're going to keep them on task. And if it's a game, playing with good behavior, because it's already been stressed to them. They've already learned all the rules. They've already been held accountable for the rules. by the teacher before we release them to playing it on their own with maybe um, newer content that isn't totally mastered, but is going to give them that repetition. And we can level the content to the student's needs. So even there's lots of different activities you can do that you just level it up. You make the level of difficulty harder. So for some kids that have already kind of mastered the content, now we want to do it quickly. So we want to add a fluency component to it. Where some kids, they're barely mastered the content. We want to get them to put it all together and to show that they can do it before we say, now we've been driving in the parking lot, let's get you on the highway, right? We don't want to jump on the highway too fast. We want to make sure that everything is mastered before we get there, right? As far as an activity is concerned. All right. Then we want to internalize the information. And so when I go from grade to grade, what I hear all the time is third grade will say, well, they should have learned this in second grade. They should have learned, second grade's like they should have learned this in first grade. And I taught high school, middle school, elementary school, all the grades. And it was not unusual to hear that from virtually every grade. Why didn't they learn this before? But the reality is they probably did learn it. They've heard it, every year, but they heard it for a week and nobody made sure that this stuff was internalized because we have so much to get through. How do we get this to be, and what needs to be internalized? What is really important? What are the things that need to be repeated? So in that internalized step, um, this is where we want to say, okay, I've taught you all your sounds and you can do it, right? But can you do them quickly? Do you actually have them to where you can recall them quickly and efficiently? Oftentimes that's a no. As soon as I try to do something for speed, the kids will disintegrate, right? If I give them enough time. So when I do standardized measures with kids, they're different measures. I can give something like the woodcock, the kids get time to sit and break down a word and then blend it together and get credit. But I give them something like the tower, which is the test of word reading efficiency. They only have 45 seconds. So that really kind of lets me know, is this automatic, right? Are they efficient? Can they pull it out? Because we don't want to give kids, 10 seconds per word. When they're reading a story, they'll never finish a book. And imagine if they had to read War and Peace, they'd be there for the rest of their natural life, right? So we have to kind of make sure that these things can be applied, that we're being repetitive in a very systematic way so that the kids get the opportunity to practice. One of my biggest things is the kids need to be expressive. They need to be talking. They need to be explaining what they've learned. They need to be showing us what they learned. They can be doing it with a peer. But when we're receptive, like right now, you guys are all sitting there listening, you're being receptive. I'm being expressive. Later when we can, do question and answer, we'll get a little bit more, back and forth. But oftentimes when you're expressive, you're like, oh yeah, I got it. Totally cool. And then you go to try it on your own and you're like, oh, that was a disaster, right? Like all the Pinterest fails that we see on the internet where you tried it, looked easy, and it was harder than you thought. So for kids, if they get a practice being expressive, it's going to be more likely that they're going to be able to understand it and internalize it and recognize where they go wrong, where they're going, right? And then make it multisensory. If we can make it visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and tactile, then we do increase engagement. And we know that. We know that people would rather be involved in an activity than watching. You're going to be more likely to learn it and internalize it if you're actually touching the things and manipulating them and talking about them than if you're just kind of, an outside observer, right? So learning about math all the time. Imagine if you went to math class and no one ever gave you a problem to be expressive and show that you know it. Like how do we bring all these things together so that kids are learning, right? So the internalizing model that I kind of use. So if I were to sort kids into groups, I am really just kind of like a proctor. I'm getting called over when there's a disagreement about an activity or I hear things being done incorrectly. I can turn my direction, my attention to group 2. I can monitor behavior if I think group 4 is getting a little bit loud or off task. I can adjust an activity if they finish way faster than I thought they would. I can be like, well, now turn it over and do da 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 da, right? But I'm more of a floater, and I'm making sure that things are running, smoothly, but also listening for, um, you know, errors and guiding the practice. But and then the kids can kind of rotate, but I'm giving them opportunities in small groups to practice on things that they need particular practice with, right? Um, then I have the teach and release model, which, maybe I'm teaching something that would be much better taught in a small group activity. Then as they rotate through, I'm going to teach that same new activity to all of these groups. And then the other groups, like 2, 3, and 4, will be activities that they have already been taught and released to be able to practice those activities. Um, I tend to do most of my, teaching in whole group for this before I release them. And I'll even, sometimes have like a small group where people watch what the kids are doing. The kids watch other kids and learn that way, because I'd rather be in the, um, you know, first model where I'm, trying to help them with internalizing the concepts that they've learned. But I do have some kids, especially for an activity that I use called like soundtrack there, um, that may have really kind of severe short-term working memory issues or auditory discrimination issues. And then um, I'm going to want to teach them because they were not picking up in a whole group setting, right? Um, and then there's the reteaching model. So if I have kids that have certain activities that they're almost internalized, that they're getting pretty good at, or they need some practice at, that can be our stations 2, 3, and 4. But I know when group 1 gets to me that they're really having trouble with auditory discrimination. I might work on dictation of like and because an F and a TH sound very similar if you're not looking at the speaker's mouth, right? So maybe we're working on dictation and hearing the difference between those sounds, or hearing the difference between an I and an E. And I might have 5 kids that are really struggling with that. Even though the class has had to move forward, I'm going to go back and I'm going to possibly reteach some concepts that I would have expected at this point were mastered, right? Maybe group 2 is CVC blending because I've got these kids and they're going, act, and then we go to blend it and they're like potato. So maybe I have to, which has happened to me. So, which I'm going to pull back. I'm going to see how they're doing, maybe go back to BC, then add CVC. And I'm really reteaching and trying to get them caught up to the rest of the class. Um, Group 3 might be fluency. They're doing really well. Like they're blending, they're discriminating, but we're seeing that they are much slower than the rest of the group and they need more repetition when it comes to fluency. So I might be pulling them aside and doing some repeated readings with them and monitoring them and giving them an extra dose of whatever it is that we're having difficulty with. It could be not even speed, but prosody. And with this group, everybody else is doing well with expression. And I use phrase drills and scooping those together and lilting their voice the way that we typically read we're stress time language, so we have a certain rhythm. Um, and I might have kids that are still, kind of sound like a robot, where they're accurate, but they're not able to read by phrasing. So I might be doing that in that group. Um, Group 4, I might have the kids who, as we know, spelling is not something that comes naturally to a lot of kids. You may just have a poor orthographic memory, which means you don't remember what words look like, right? So you're going to need extra repetition with certain words that are maybe the trickier ones that you need to see it, because like an average kid may need to see it 4, 5 times. or like a more advanced kid, and then another kid 10 to 15. And we have kids that it's hundreds of times that they need that repeated practice in a very structured way. We can't keep giving them new words and never going back to the ones that they haven't mastered, right? So if they're high frequency, then they need to know them. They're everywhere. They're going to be words that they need to be able to read and spell, uh, the majority of the words, right? Because of the majority of the words on the page. Um, so we can't just say, like, I taught that for a week and we're done and we're moving on. So that group 4 might be, high frequency words. And it could be, these could be all different, topics. I just tried to pick just your kind of basic science of reading activities. But even if I was doing, fluency practice, I could have some kids on CVC and some kids that are already doing story fluency, some kids that are, kind of moving ahead and working ahead through the high frequency words and doing fluency with them on that. If I decide that everything's going to be fluency, right? Because fluency is not going to hurt anyone. Practice reading and doing repeated readings. We know there's a ton of research on how effective it is and how it improves our comprehension. And that you can't change someone's basic processing speed. We know that if you, have a retrieval speed that is, in the 25th percentile, we're not going by doing fluency practice, we're not going to change your fluency speed, but what we're going to do is help you to overlearn and maximize the speed that you have so that you may not be retrieving everything more quickly, but you'll be able to retrieve the things that you've overlearned related to reading at a better rate, which is going to artificially look like you are now retrieving faster, but you're basically just retrieving what you've overlearned faster. Right? So I don't need to spend a lot of time seeing if you can retrieve the name of my long lost pets because that's not going to come in handy. Right? Where they're like, oh, well, when you were in second grade, you had a German Shepherd puppy named Candy. No, I don't need anyone to be able to retrieve that quickly. But what we do need is for them to be able to read all these high frequency words quickly, to be able to access the phoneme grapheme correspondences quickly, that they have an ease and efficiency to reading that will help to maximize their retrieval speed. And it's not uncommon that you can take a child who initially is reading in the 25th percentile and get them up to the 50th with good repeated reading practice and fluency practice, as long as it's targeted. Um, so we want to get the best out of our kids, that we can get, because that's going to make their life easier and learning easier for the rest of their life. So that is reteaching model. Now I'm going to show you some activities and how I do those activities, so you can kind of see what I would put in those centers. Now, before I do that, I would like to say that if you do not have a long phonics / reading / language arts block, um, you shouldn't even really be doing centers, right? So if you, because I've had people say to me, well, if I have 20 minutes, what could I be doing in my phonics 20 minutes? I'm like, if you only have 20 minutes, you need to be doing direct teacher instruction, right? Those 20 minutes, you can be doing direct teacher instruction to everyone. That's going to be way more beneficial for a whole group. So, um, because it always surprises me when someone's like, okay, well, I'll teach them a ton of stuff. And then they'll say, well, how do I do this in 20 minutes? I'm like, I don't know. That's impossible. There's just way too much, because involved in like phonics is also everything else, handwriting. And, if you don't understand what we're teaching, then that's comprehension. Everything's linked, right? Grammar is linked to spelling. Spelling is linked to phonics. These things are, reading is linked to phonics and grammar. I don't know how people separate them apart. So if you have limited time, maybe centers are something you do um, once every 2 weeks, or one, where you can get an opportunity to be more targeted. Um, and then the other thing would be fight for more time. So there's a lot to learn and a lot for kids to practice. And so if you have an hour and you want to do 15 minutes every other day, or you have 120 minutes, where I've definitely noticed a lot more time being given to teachers nowadays. It's uh, for them to be able to teach all of this, then you can incorporate more of this, right? Because direct instruction, direct, explicit, teacher-led instruction, we know is the best way to teach kids this information. We've had enough years of whole language of teachers saying, just read more and you're going to figure it out, to know that that's not working, right? But we can also incorporate in, you know, kids discovering and exploring and learning about words, and integrate morphology and oral language and all of these things in as well in that time frame. Um, but uh, and the centers can kind of help us to do that for the kids that need it. Um, when I have kids that have like amazing oral vocabularies, then I'm probably not going to put them at a center where I want to hear the kids use all of our high frequency words in sentences, right? But I will have kids that can't do that. And I will have kids that have a hard time retrieving. They're going to need more practice doing that. So I can focus, during that time with those kids. Right. So let me show you. I know people will probably have some opinions on that, but um, we know what works, and and you can differentiate whole group instruction. You just do a lot of repetition and folding back and reteaching, and um, but still giving them whole group activity to um, you know that you're leading. So definitely teacher led. All right, so these are activities that I've used and quite frequently. Uh, but remember, anything that I do in a center is not new. Like, the activity has already been taught, and the activity the kids know, mostly to mastery. Otherwise, it's going to be chaos, and I don't really like chaos. I want it to be, well, I call it controlled chaos, because I do like kids to be talking. I like them to be engaged. I like more than one kid to be talking at a time, and I think that's okay as long as we have it as kind of a controlled event and not just random screaming. So if I'm going to do, um, this is what I call discovery word quicksand. And so the way that I came up with this idea, I was working with a school, and there was this little girl, and she was sitting at a table. I don't know why she was by herself, but she was sitting over there with um, a, a cup of popsicle sticks and some Play-Doh. And what she had to do was pull a word out of the popsicle sticks, and it had a word written on it. And then she had to make that word out of Play-Doh. So she was making the word was out of Play-Doh. And so I said to her, I said, "Oh, what word are you making?" And she goes, "This one." And I go, "What does it say?" And she's like, "I don't know." Thought, why are you doing this? Why are you randomly spelling words that you don't know how to read them? That would be like me just randomly molding words, Russian words. That would make no sense. So as I was watching her do that, I thought, how could we make this activity more meaningful for her? Because I'm sure she had been taught the word was, but she just didn't retain it. So these cards, what I've done is I took the high frequency words, and after they had been taught these words and they had been mapped together with the teacher, and then we're still seeing difficulty or they still need repetition, then they can use these cards. So what the sequence is that you got to see it. So you want to look at it, then you want to spell it. So we want her to go T-O, then say it, and it's spelled phonetically at the bottom too, and then shape it. Because these words that are irregular, so the word to will only say to in isolation. In a sentence, it's most likely going to say "to." So depending on what you've taught your kids, right? So I'm going to go to the store, to the store. Um, so in connected speech, it ends up being unaccented. So then I have them mold it. The kids always make fun of me because I'm not the best molder. They're like, "You've got to roll it," and what? And I don't know. They're so critical. Um, I'm doing my best. Uh, and so then I would just make it into the shape. And what we're doing is we're really kind of like staring at it, right? So we've got the TO says two, we said it, we saw it, we spelled it, we're shaping it, and the kids like to mold it, right? And what's going to happen is once they're done, then let's say, see, fell apart because I'm not good at this. So they would say two, they've done this, and let's say the other target word maybe was have, right? Then they would see it, spell it, say it, shape it, and these could be the words that they are, working on for the day, or the ones that we've seen them misspell in their writing. Um, And once if they're at a table with three or four other kids, once they're done with whatever words that they have had to mold, the thing I like about this stuff is that it doesn't dry out. That's so cool. So if the kids left it out, it doesn't dry out, and you just keep reusing it over and over again. So um, of course, later we're going to learn that this is a phonetic word because words in English don't end in V, and we'll just have to add an E at the end, so it's the same as live or give. But for right now, we're learning how to spell it and making sure that we know that we have that E on there. Now, once they've molded it, then they can ask their friend to quiz them. So they can hand them to their friend, and their friend would say, spell have, and they would have to go HAVE. And then if they did it correctly, then they get to go to the next one. Otherwise, their friend hands it back and says, do that again. Right. So that we make sure that um, they're getting that repetitive practice. But it could be any number of words. It could be laugh, which is also tricky for some kids, but also phonetic once you learn that UGH is another um, grapheme that can spell the f sound. So, but even if we know that for reading, we may not remember it for spelling. So this way is helping them with words that are highly frequent, that they might need to discover more about later, but they definitely have a reason. But for now, they might just need to be able to remember what it looks like and what letters form these words before they move forward. So the kids, the good thing about this is that it's expressive, it's engaging because the kids love to play with this stuff, and if it ends up on the floor, then they don't get to play with it, right? um and if it disappears, then they don't get to play with it. So they take good care of it and they make sure that it gets back in the bag when we're done. And if anything drops off of it, you'll just see the kids like picking it all up, and they don't want it taken away from them. So it's good to give them something in a center or station that they are excited about using, and know that if they don't use it properly, that they're may not get to do that. Right. So this would be our discovery word, quicksand. Now, if we're working on these, and we also want to work on spelling, then if they've learned, so when I teach handwriting, I make sure that it is on a 45-degree angle. If you're a lefty, it should go this way, and if you're a righty, it should go this way. When we put paper straight up and down, then that causes kids to twist their hand and try to they'll have bad pencil grip. It causes stress all the way up their arm. So we want to try to get them to have their correct, I call it starting position. So I'm left-handed. This would be my starting position. This way, my arm is going to follow a natural um, shape. If I did this, I'm contracting all my all my muscles all the way up. And it kind of makes me laugh. People are like, what do you do with lefties? And I'm like, the same thing you do with righties. You just turn it exactly the other way. There's no like weird thing. And they're like, well, won't their hand drag across it? I'm like, not if it's turned correctly. I'm going to do the same thing as a righty would do. Right. So, um, So we would do this, but they've already learned how to do the process. So they would have all their tools, because this is gather your tools, right? They had to put their name at the top, gather their tools. So they're going to have a crayon, they're going to have a pencil, they're going to have their ink. And I'm telling you, the ink is very motivating. So when we turn our paper, they're going to have to go T, right? So we've got our arrows showing you down and then across. O, right? And I always do this spells too, right? So if kids are having trouble with fluent reading, then I say spells to, like to the store, right? Then I'm going to switch to my finger and see if I've gathered any evidence of, and I can feel a tactile letter because this screen will make the wax from the crayon stay behind. Then I'm going to go over it 3 times. T-O spells 2, T. Now I want to see what I remember. So I flip it over, take it out of my short-term working memory, and see if I can remember how I would spell that word. I always say that the kids can flip it back if they are unsure, right? So if they can't remember, I don't call it cheating, I call it self-checking, right? So if they turn it over and they don't remember, then they can go back and flip it over. So now they can go T-O, they're going to use their fingerprint ink to space, and then they get to write it again. And so the fingerprint ink is pretty cool because it just wipes right off your finger. It doesn't stay, it just disappears. It's not toxic. And if they leave it open, then it doesn't dry out. So, but it is honestly one of the most frequently pickpocketed items that I have. So you have to keep an eye on them because these really, really nice, sweet kids will just randomly take it with them. Right. Then once they've, written it across the bottom, then I'll ask them to map it, right? So we can say, I want you to, we practice doing our mapping. So they love using the roller. So then I'm like, okay, if we have this word to, ooh, how many sounds do we have? We have 1 sound, 2 sounds. Now we have to put our graphemes in the box. And I'll have them go back and map it based on the sound, and we can see if they know how to spell it. So if I was doing have, I would take the same sheet, right? And then do my handwriting. And then I can go back and say, okay, I have how many sounds? Ah, right? And there are 3. And these 3 sounds, and this is what would go in the box. So we can just use the back of a sheet of paper, anything that they've been working on, and we can just do our little, what I call dot and jot, and other people call phoneme grapheme mapping, so that the kids can just use whatever they have to practice that. Right. So that would be another way to do that. And then thirdly, if I'm working on these, then I would say, we could be doing our discovery dig game, which, if my kids are higher level, then I don't separate them out if I think that they are capable of, reading and most of them and spelling, but most of the time what I'll do is I'll sort them by what I've taught. Right. So if I haven't taught this word, this might be really hard. They'll be like, whoa, and we don't want that happening. So, so I might keep it to more of our, easily decodable words. And then sprinkle in some of the harder ones but I've actually already explicitly taught, right? And so just for example's sake, the way that we play this, it's great because in a center, it works awesome. If you have 3 or 4 different kids, you can even sometimes, mix abilities. So if I have 5, I deal out 5 cards, to each kid. And so if I have mine, and this would be our, draw pile, I would turn to the kid next to me and say, box. I found a box with a present in it. And then they have to spell box. If they go BOX, they get it. They get to put it in their discoveries because we are discovering how to spell these words. And it would go face up, facing everybody else in the group. So if another kid was like, oh, I can never spell box, they get to at least look at it. Right. And then maybe next time they would remember how to spell it. If it was my turn, it was my turn and they said learn. I learn a lot in school and I have to spell learn. I say LERN. They would say no, and it goes in the discard pile face up. So at least I get to see it. And this is how it's spelled, right? So I didn't earn that as one of my discoveries, but I can hopefully learn that next time I have to put that extra letter in there. But I'm practicing using it and the other kids. So it's an expressive receptive task. So what we're doing here is everything is like expressive, receptive, engaging, active, but targeted for what it is that they need to be working on. Right. So for some of my kids, I would not put the word learn in there, but the word was would be in there. Right. Some kids can handle, if I've taught, you have to keep moving for, 2/3 of your class, but you've got a third that maybe they're still, 3 weeks, 4 weeks behind. Pull out those newer words and just let them get some repetitive practice with the ones that they're still struggling with. And then you can start adding the new ones back in as they start showing some mastery and give them more practice with it. And that's kind of how I would work on high frequency words. And so then the kids think, they're getting all these, cool things, but really what they're just getting is that repetitive, targeted practice at a station for things that they need to, know how to do. Right. And so, and I can adjust it. I can give kids, the TO, or I could give kids, through or though or should, depending on, what they can handle so that we're targeting words that they're missing. Okay. So if I have, kids with the reversals and handwriting, then I've got handwriting where I can do the same thing. Right. So we're going to say, B says, B, put our grid under it, practice it, flip it over, see what we remember. Which is, an easy way to work on that. But let's say I have kids with some blending difficulties. I use a game called Code Quest. And so Code Quest has vowels and consonants in it. And if I need to do vowel to consonant blending, then I have borders. These are all the ending sounds. These are vowels. Okay. So if I want to work on blending and I don't think they can handle 3 sounds, then I'll just start with vowel consonant. So if I turn these over, and I have kids playing together, then what we do is we flip over one, let's say 2 kids are playing, just because my document camera can't, show too many words. So if I have, and then I'm going to flip over the next 2 cards and I have, and that's a hard one, so probably should have not done that one. But initially, let's say we have un and im. They should be able to blend un, I, im. And I can just keep it to single vowels or vowel teams that have been taught early on that they need some repetitive practice with. Because if you can't blend two sounds, giving a kid a third sound is just going to make them really super frustrated. And if we can get two sounds really consistent, then we can start adding a third sound in between. And so if I have un and they have m, if it's a real word will always win. But if it's not, then the numbers win. So a 10 beats a 5 and a 3 beats a 2. So we have two winners and they would go in different directions. We flip this over again. Now, the only time that I get called over to these groups after, when they're playing is usually for a kid that goes, Esh. I have a friend named Esh, so it's real. Or, my dog's name is Esh. And then I have to say, no proper nouns. They have to be real words. We all have to be in agreement. It can't just, be a random name. So we would have Eve and then Esh. And since neither one of those are real, then we would play by the numbers. So a 7 beats a 4 and a 5 beats a 1. So the person on the top gets all of those. Now, once I can start adding a beginning sound, then we start adding the beginning sound. Currently, I only have single vowels, pretty easy, but I can have groups that are doing more advanced, vowel sounds, and I can include those in here so that they can have practice, reading those, right? And it depends on just what they've been taught, what they know. And this is a good activity for a center because it's controlled. Because if I flip over the center, right, I have, and oi, then, and this isn't a good one either. So, oops. So what's going to happen is, even though words in English don't end in V, syllables do. So you could have like liver, right? So these are, the border is for things that could come at the beginning, things that could come at the end. You will not have an R at the end, because if there's an R at the end of a syllable, it is an R controlled syllable. So it would have, ER or IR or whatever. So a consonant R is really only going to be at the beginning, just like an ng is never going to be at the beginning of a word, because that would be really hard to say. It would only be at the end, right? So the borders keep it controlled, so you won't have your students trying to pronounce this, which would be very hard, right? So that way they can play with each other without having to, because certain things don't come at the end. A W is, the W sound is never going to be at the end of a word, right? So it only has a beginning border. That way they would be able to blend it. So even if it's not real, it still could be blended in English. And if you invent something, you could, call it a loive if you want to. Right. So if they can blend these, then they can play a game with each other. And normally I have these stacked like 4 or 5 down, and one kid is designated as a dealer, right? They get to flip them over. That if a kid wins their stack, then they're the dealer the next time. And so at the end, you could say, okay, we're out of cards. So everybody just takes what they have and counts them and see, who is the winner and who had the most cards, and then you can get to play again. And just, this would be something that they would have already learned. So maybe this is a new sound and it's not mastered, but the game has been mastered because they've been playing it since they were doing, ip and then bip and lip and lup and, lug and all of those, initial spellings, right? So that's another thing that I use a lot of times for centers, which is that CDC for blending. Then if we're working on like so this is like our story. I'll say, okay, you're going to pair up and you're going to listen to your friend and you're going to time them. And we have little, hand timers, and they listen to their friend and they write down how long it took them, the total amount of time. Right. Or I might say, I want you guys to alternate sentences with each other. Um, and time both of you together, because it's just about, let's see if we can get, a little bit faster, a little more accurate. They can give each other feedback. They don't grade each other. It's not like I'm going to allow them to, give each other a grade, but they can give feedback to each other. But all of that is modeled. So I would model feedback. What is a kind thing to say when somebody misses a word, right? How can we support our friend? Because I'm telling you for sure, if they're not supportive and they're not kind, I'll hear about it. So we might have to have a whole group refresher on how we support our friends when going through fluency drills. But doing 3 or 4 repeated readings of this, depending on their age, could take, some time. So I might alternate, because if I say time or time is up, I don't want that only one had an opportunity to read. The same thing with the games. They don't need to finish a game for me to say time. It's like if I say time, wherever we are, that's where we're stopping. And so whoever has the most cards when we stop, um, that's kind of how we'll work through that. But now I could have the ask story for these kids for additional practice, even though I might be further down, and I can have another table. They have a more complex text, but they're still doing the same type of activity with each other. And we can continue to um, differentiate. If I say, okay, I want you to, practice rewriting some of the sentences. Um, Working memory is a big issue. So what I'll say to them is, okay, I want you to, read a sentence. Of course, this one's very short. So then I want you to flip it over and I want you to rewrite that sentence. And so they will rewrite that sentence. Then I want you to read the first, read the rest of it. Then I want you to try to remember another sentence, flip it over, and they get to rewrite another sentence. And so then they're like, I already forgot what it was. Meet Pat. I might need to practice this. When you reach a certain age, your memory just starts to go. So if we go through this, right, some people stop their M in the middle, but you're like, they have to make sure they have proper punctuation and letter formation, and then they can practice whichever ones of the sentences up, at, right? So capital P. And I don't punish them for flipping back over. I call that self-checking. Um, and then they can feel confident flipping it back over. Because a lot of our kids who have, dyslexia or language learning differences, their short-term working memory, phonological memory is very poor. So they flip it over. Um, I thought it was meet Chad and it was meet Pat. Chad is in the story, but maybe they forgot. They flip it back over. They get to look at it. And it helps them to build that capacity. And you want them to try to, flip it over less and less and be able to hold more and more in their short-term working memory. This is really going to help improve the written expression, to be able to hold things and to be able to, um, process them all. All right. So these are just some of the activities and how I differentiate. I'm hoping that you can see that I just picked different levels. This would be like a sound drill if I've got kids, maybe we're not reading words because we're still messing up all of our B's and D's. We might go back and do some practice on getting our sounds correct at the sound level. And I can strategically set those out for kids to make sure that they, um, are getting what they need. So, on Thursday, we're going to talk more about like more specifics about how to sort, how to lay out different activities. You can bring questions and, um, you know, and what you're struggling with in your classes, and we can talk about that there as well. And that's our click. And then we give, we'll send home these materials and how to use them and how to differentiate with them. But for now, for those of you who don't want to stick around for Q&A, you can go do whatever you do in the evenings. But I'm going to start looking at some of the questions. Is there
Amazing. Thank
anything
you,
in
Cynthia.
particular that was jumping out for you? Emma, that I need to kind of address first?
Yes, yeah. Well,
I
just
was
a
looking
few
at 'em.
housekeeping items before we jump in. So some folks were asking what you receive when you sign up for the click. So we'll send you Code Quest, which you saw, Discovery Dig, which you saw, and Discovery Word Quicksand, which you saw. So all of those you would get by attending the click. And folks who attend the click also receive Jennifer's slides. So if you wanted another peek at those, if you want to have them as a reference during that interactive session, we'll make sure that you have what you need. But mainly the questions are kind of talking about general centers. So first up, what's the ideal number of students per station or center?
I think that it depends on what you're asking them to do, and it also depends on their personalities. So, um, if I'm doing fluency and I've got kids who are slower processors, I don't put my fastest processor who's going to just answer for the child or cut them off or anything. So, we all know our kids, and if I've got more kind of behaviory kids, then I need them, not with another behavior kid, or with a, stronger, bossier personality that can keep them in line in an activity because I'm really strict about who can do. I'm not gonna let one kid ruin it for everybody. I'm gonna pull them, out, and have another activity ready for them. But um, the games are such a good way to internalize information and get hundreds and hundreds of repetitions in one sitting that I'm not gonna let one kid mess it up for everybody else to get that level of internalization of a concept. But um I've had, for the blending when I do that, the three sounds with kindergarten and first grade, I've had 5 or 6 kids that I've done it with, and I put them at the end of a rectangular table, so I don't want anyone reading upside down. And I put them down, and they know that if they read someone else's word, then they lost their turn, right?
Mhm.
So the kids are less likely to, you only need one kid to lose a turn, and then they don't do it again. So um, because they wanna play, they want to get the and but I call it using my powers for good, not evil, to play games and have you know, these kind of expressive it doesn't have to be quiet and everybody, not talking. You can still, benefit from that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also nice that you can control it so much, if you have groups that are at different levels, that's a really great way to differentiate. Okay, I'm scared to give my students too much. How will I know if I've given them too much information too quickly?
So, too much information too quickly, um, means they can't apply it, right? So, there's that saying, it's like the straw that broke the camel's back. They don't say it's like the anvil that broke the camel's back, right? It's like you give one sound too many, and then you'll start to see that things they were consistent on, they're no longer consistent. It seems like what they were doing has fallen out. So I always just say, let's pull back, right? Like if you're at a party and people are introducing you to people and you were really great at remembering the names, and then all of a sudden a group of 5 or 6 comes in and you're like, they're gone. That just I don't remember anything now. So that to me just means pull back, repeat. I never introduce more than 1 or 2 things at a time. It doesn't mean that it's 1 or 2 things a day. It just means at a time. And if they can show me they know it and they're applying it and we're kind of using it in practice, then I might go forward and do another. I would never do 10 things. And because in the same amount of time, doing 2 at a time, you could get to 20. Whereas if you had 10, you might still be working on the same 10 because they never got a chance to master anything. So to
Mhm.
me, I'd always just be like, what is it deteriorating? Let's pull back. If we're seeing that you were spelling these words, these high frequency words that we had last month constantly correctly, and then all of a sudden I introduce a few more, and then I'm just going to bring them back, and I'm going to do more with that until they're solid.
That makes total sense. Yeah. Um, okay, similar kind of behavior question. How do I get my students back on track when they start chatting amongst themselves? Do you have any tips?
Well, to me, um, consistency is key. So if I say, if you're talking, we're not doing this, then I just say, okay, everybody, let's get back to our seats. And I pick their least favorite activity to do. So, um, I try to reward, like, I am very much an on task uh teacher. So my rewards are actually on task. I'm like probably the only person that doesn't show a movie every once in a while. I'm like, oh, you know what we'll do for our extra thing? We'll go outside and we'll air write words in the sky. And they get excited because they lay in the grass and we write in the sky. And they're like, I'm like, time to go in. They're like, oh, can we do two more? And I'm like, you're practicing spelling. But they think because they went outside that it was a, big adventure. Um, so I just have something for them to look forward to. We can earn our way to do whatever it is that they like, and then I'm very strict about, um, I'm not mean about it. I'm just like, sorry, too bad, so sad. Let's get back in our seats. You knew the rule, and then next time, we move forward. If it's one kid, then I try really hard not to punish the whole class, or if it's, just a couple, then those are going to be, maybe they have to go over and do a worksheet. um, so I mean, it's really about consistency and setting expectations. And I don't say things that I learned the hard way, like when I first started, if you do that, we're never doing that again. And then I'm like, but I want to do it again. So I just like it. Well, lose if we can't do this, we won't do it for a week, right? And then if it happens again, we're not gonna do it for 2 weeks, until they can be like, okay. Um, and then the other kids help to police, some of it. Like if you don't stop, we're not gonna be able to do this. We're gonna have to go back and do
Mhm.
worksheets. So
Mhm.
then they kind of, but it is like parenting. It's consistency and it's um, you know, expectations.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, it's so nice to hear you talk about, wanting to support students and teaching them to support each other. That's such a nice like layer to this center's activity. Okay. So can you talk a little bit more about activities that you use to gather data? I know that was one of the components on that slide. So if you can talk a little bit more about that.
So, um, I have couple different jobs. So one of them is, we do standardized testing at our reading center in Atlanta. And so kids come in and we do actually nationally normed standardized assessments like you would get in a educational psychological. Well, then I can completely customize a plan, right, for the kids that we have that. But that's pretty intense. How are you going to do that in a classroom? So in a classroom, sometimes you do have that information, but you can't just make your groups from scores. And that is really what people have to realize is that if I say, Bobby missed 10 and Susie missed 10 and Annie missed 10, I'm going to put them together. But maybe the 10 that, one of them missed, they were just guessing based on the first letter. Right. And then the other kid just had some reading reversals. They were reading the D's as B's or B's as D's. And the 10 at the, for the last kid, maybe it was, um, just certain vowels they missed, and that was it. So just because a kid misses 10 doesn't mean that they need to be in the same group based on number, and that happens a lot. So I really think you need to see the error responses. So if you just get a printout and somebody took it on the computer, I don't think that that's a great way to sort. Right. So they might say they have trouble with blending. Well, why is it? They can't hold three sounds in their memory and blend, or they don't know the sounds. Right. Or there's lots of reasons why they couldn't get those right. And so you have to me, I use, in a classroom, a curriculum based measure. So if I can pull a kid aside and use like, and, we had the fluency drills, and I say, I'm going to listen to kids, read for 10 seconds, I really quickly can see who can, knows their B's and their D's, or who can blend, or who is just randomly guessing, or, and then I can sort them that way. Um, and say, because I kind of joke with parents. I'm like, at the beginning they got 20 mistakes. Now they only have 10, and they're like, but that's 10 mistakes. And I'm like, but their mistakes also are getting better. And they're like, what's a good mistake? And I'm like, but there are good mistakes, right? Like, you got into a car accident and you bent your fender. That's way better than I totaled the car and 3 other cars with me. It's still a mistake, but one is way better. There's shoplifting and there's murder. There's mistakes are on a scale. So your child is just shoplifting words. This other kid is just murdering them. And so how do you sort that way? Sometimes you have a kid who has 5 mistakes, but they're the same mistakes that the kid with 10 mistakes made, right?
Mm,
So let's group those guys together because maybe those were all mistakes based on reversals. You know, maybe so based on speed and need for practice and repetition. So, um, one kid might have gotten um, read 30 words or another kid read 5, we should put the kid who's only reading 5 or 10 words together and do fluency practice. Um, and we can customize it that way. So kind of grouping by not just the number of mistakes, which is oftentimes what we get on a printout, but the quality and quantity of the types of mistakes. We can easily um, group kids that way.
okay. Yeah, that's helpful. Similarly, so one person wanted to know if the way you're describing the center activities, are you typically choosing like one big idea to focus on? Like the centers are all about fluency or all about decoding,
Well,
or you mix it
I
up?
vary it quite frequently. So like I can say like not everybody has to get to every center, right?
Mm,
And so maybe I know that we're not gonna, get that far. But when I do vocabulary work, um, I can easily say you're going to do vocabulary, but this table is doing these 5 words and this is doing these 5 words because even if we're CVC and they, um, you know, don't know hit, right? Like a hit could be that record was a hit or I hit the ball. Then we might want to work on that before we try to do wit, like she has a sharp wit. But I could give some of my other kids who have good vocabularies and they really know the other words. I could give them words like that to use in a sentence and to um, practice with thinking about can you use it as a noun, can you use it as a verb, like all of those. And that's they could all be doing the same thing at their center. It's just been leveled um, and grouped. So
mm,
we just have our vocabulary tables. But they have to know the independent activity. So, the thing is about centers is when they say they need to be doing them independently, I teach the games whole group. Like I'll use a document camera and I'll say, this is half the class is team A, half the class is team B. And they take turns and they learn, okay, who won, team A or team B? Um, they're basically I'm guiding them in a teacher led way to play that game. And then I'll say, like, do you guys think you could handle playing this? Right. And they of course say yes. And I'm like, well, maybe we need a little more practice. And I'll do it in that teacher model where I have a group and I'm teaching and releasing.
mm,
So I've already done it whole group. I've already talked about the rules, and then I do it small group where maybe they're all doing fluency, then we swap or whatever they're working on. So they should be able to do the activity independently, and that's the key. Is that we're not saying I have to pick easier activities because um, they have to learn it in 30 seconds. But the content might be new or different to them.
mm,
So, okay, we know how to do fluency, we know how to do our paired readings, and we practice that over and over, and that process is good. Now I can give harder stories, or I could give phrase drills, or I could give, different types of fluency activities because they now know independently how to use the timer. They
mm,
know how to respect the fingerprinting. They know how to do so. So we just switch out the content, but the activity um, is something they can be independent on.
mm,
And if I have to do all small groups of the same activity for a while, and I'm a floater of the same activity, but I'm just kind of monitoring everybody to make sure they're doing it, okay, independently. And then once that is, solid, then I can say, okay, I'm going to go get a group and teach a new activity.
Mm.
Right. So sometimes it doesn't move as fast as you want and you don't have as many different centers as you want, but it is much better for your own sanity to make sure that they're really solid on the process
Quality over
before you
quantity.
quality over quantity.
Yeah.
Right. It's like organized chaos doesn't bother me. Chaotic chaos oh yeah, that is a problem.
Makes
So
total sense.
so yeah, so I don't think it's impossible. It just takes like a, it's just like anything, teaching your kids to stand in line when they're in kindergarten, getting them to remember their lunch number when they're in third grade or whatever it is, getting them to open a locker in sixth grade. That that's so hard, So I'm like, no, left, right, left. No, you can't go around twice. Like very explicit instruction, lots of practice, and then eventually, you don't have to go out there every time and open their locker,
Mhm.
right? So
Yeah. Right.
all skills kind of are that way. I mean, it's just sometimes we're impatient. We think we need to get through more, but if we can solidify the process, kids like consistency mixed with novelty. So we get the process down, and then we can have something to look forward to, like air raiding outside, or whatever it is that we're gonna throw in as a kind of a novel task.
Mhm.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Any other ones?
Yes. Okay. Slightly different. So, what if my students ask me why a word is spelled a certain way and I don't know or I don't have enough information to answer?
Okay. So one, don't lie. uh, I worked with a teacher once where she said whenever a kid asked me about a word that I don't know, she said, I just say it's French. And I'm like, that's horrible. The kid's gonna go to France and be like, come was should. And that's not French, right? So to me, I learned all this stuff the hard way. I didn't know why any of these things existed. So I would say to them, I don't know, but I'll try to find out for you. Right. And so sometimes I'm like, I haven't had a chance. We'll get to it by the end of the year. Right. And if they're six, maybe they'll forget. I'm just kidding. But it does take a while to learn why. But just don't say things like English is crazy, because it's not. These words make sense. We just don't know yet. That's why I call them discovery words, because we have to discover more about it. Um, saying it's crazy takes a lot of their power away to figure out what they do mean. There are websites like Edum Online, which is a good website. I don't know if you type that in for me.
Yeah.
And you can go there and they'll give you maybe not exact reasons, but a good little history about a lot of the words that you can say, oh, it's Latin or it's Old English or it used to be spelled like this. Because people will say words like, bomb, B-O-M-B. Why is there a B at the end? And then you go and look and you're like, oh, it's from like bombus, which was Latin, and they just kind of dropped the end. So
Hmm.
it used to be pronounced and now it's not. So that's a good way you can explore it. Sometimes you get like really inquisitive kids, and if you answered every one of their questions, you would be there the rest of your natural life. So sometimes I will say to them, oh, we'll get to that, just because I have to continue. I have things I've got to teach. I can't stop for every word. And usually it's because I know we will get to that. Or I've also had a class where I had them write their questions. I let them put it on a post-it, and then I would look at the post-its and um, find the answers and then talk to them about that way. So it just depends on, but asking why is so valuable, and you want to encourage it. You don't want to discourage it, because you want them to be curious. And, I lied once. I lied once. And then after I did it, I was like, why did I just say that? And and I was teaching 11th grade English, and I think I just got nervous. um, and a kid asked me what a sepulcher was, and I described a scepter. Like, I know that's not what it is. I don't know why it's coming out of my mouth. And so after that day, I was like 24 and they were 18. It was like, what did you just do that? And the next day I apologized. I was like, I don't know why I said that. And I explained everything. And And since then, I've never lied. I've been wrong lots of times, but I've never lied. So
Hmm.
um, that I think is really important.
It's valuable. Well, and it's nice to have discussions. I know in other trainings you've talked about how, developing oral language or answering questions or talking about the origin of words is a really, really great way to cater to students who maybe have stronger foundational skills than others. So they're still engaged in the activity. You're maybe still talking about Pat the rat, but you can take them a little bit further with more information without having to, you know, give them something separate necessarily.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, I just read
Hmm.
one that said behavior management is the most difficult part. Behavior
Hmm.
management is always the most difficult part, right? And that's why it's consistency and expectations. And even with all that, whether you're a teacher or a parent, your kid still has a meltdown. You don't know, they refuse to do work. Um, when I taught high school, I taught behavior disorders, and I had a kid who would not participate for like 9 weeks. Like he just wouldn't. Um and so I would talk to him and pretend he was having a conversation with me. I'm like, I'm guessing, Michael, that you're wondering what is the gross national product of Hungary? Because I was teaching geography to him at the time. And he goes, and I'll be like, and I'm glad you asked. And he thought I was an idiot, but by the end, he started perking up and then he started going, what is that? And he started asking questions. And I thought that's one of my longest hauls where I didn't shut down. I didn't stop. I came in and acted like an idiot with him like virtually every day. Um, and then he did start to participate and I had him for a couple of years. So I'm glad I put in that effort. Otherwise we would have been like at each other. But I've had, my failures as well. I had a kid that transferred and I seriously was so happy I wanted to have a party. I just couldn't get him to behave or to participate, and it was exhausting. So I get that too, right? It's not like I've gotten everyone to get on board. But it's just kind of, you know, knowing when to push. But I see like Camille saying, like when I have kids that just say, I'm done. Well, if they're playing a game where they're back and forth and they're being expressive, then the other person's going to be like, they're not doing they're supposed to, and we're not playing game, like they won't play the game. And then I just kind of pull them aside and they get to do something else. And I pick something less fun. So and then typically they'll be like, oh, I want to go back now. I'm like, oh no, I think you need more time, over there, you know, and then they'll want to go back and I'll say okay, but only if you can play you know nicely or continue play or not you know bother everybody else. And then typically they work their way back.
Hmm.
But sometimes you are going to have a kid that's just like, I'm done. They put their head down, and if everyone else can get my attention, then I might ignore them for a little bit until I have availability to work with them.
Mhm.
But it
Yeah.
is trial and error.
Yeah. Yeah. If this feels daunting, how many centers should I start with and how long should I do them?
Um, well, you can always do the same activity in 3 or 4 centers and do it for 15 minutes, and that's it. So they got to work in a small group. They got to do the activity. Something that's not just an independent thing that they could, collaborate on. So either like, you know, a game or the fluency back and forth or something that seems like it's a reward to be able to do that versus just sitting and listening to the teacher do direct instruction.
Mm.
And then, if that is successful, then then you can introduce a new thing and rotate just between those two. Um, I mean, Emma, you know this. When Emma and I worked in a literacy lab together for years, we would push into some of the classrooms and do these activities, and we would just be like, okay, every 15 minutes, they would switch, and we would rotate around, and the kids got into a habit of it. We'd be like, you know, the buzzer would go off, they would get up, they'd move to the next one, they'd sit down, and we just rotated through. So it's really just about creating consistent systems. But if they don't work, you don't have to keep doing it. Like you can fix it. But getting the kids in a habit. But uh, the worst thing, just like anything, like a New Year's resolution, you want to pick one thing. You don't want to be, I don't want to be like, I'm no longer going to eat chocolate or stay up past 10 p.m. or all the, 15 things. I'm going to end up doing nothing well. So pick
Mhm.
one thing you think you can manage that you think the kids would like. Oftentimes I'll let them vote on what they would like to do. And, like I taught you this game, which one do you want to play? And we can go into groups and play it. And then they can vote for that. Because anything they vote for, they're more invested in.
Mm.
Um, and I don't know, do you remember like the camps we did before school and on Saturdays? So
Mhm.
yeah, so we did this for interventions and we did it for 5 weeks. And with the budget that I had, I decided I was going to give the kids a tablet at the end if they had perfect attendance and they did everything. And so I did that the first cohort. And then I gave them all their tablets. I thought they were going to be super happy with that as a reward. And half of them left without the chargers. Some of them were still sitting on the tables. I was like, oh my gosh, you're kidding me. I like put a lot of my budget into this and they were just like happy for 2 seconds. So the next go round, I said, let's vote. If you get perfect attendance, you're here every time, and all the things, what should your big reward be? And they were like, a bag of candy. Really reasonable. So let them vote, let them see what they think would be a good thing and get them invested in kind of earning it and
Mhm.
and behaving.
Yeah. It was super fun and a big variety of ages. I know we're going to wrap up here in a few minutes, but I know some folks have asked about, kind of third grade and up. Again, I have experience using these activities with those kids. They have a good time.
Yeah, they have a good time. So I mean, I definitely targeted the lower grades, but you know, one that I was training today, so this is like my 16th hour today. But this morning I was training teachers of older kids and we were doing R controlled vowels, so they were like practicing reversing it. So we were playing like Go Fish and you'd have to be like, I have farm, do you have fram? And you have to say like with the AR and then with an RA. And they have to do it in their short-term memory. And it's keeps kids from, just guessing at words and not paying attention to, is it a consonant blend? Is it an R controlled vowel? When I was a little grill or happy birthday kind of thing. Um, so when I first started all these games, I was teaching high school. So the consonants I taught that game, that blending game, um, I started that when I was teaching high school, but I let them play with poker chips so they thought they could bet as to whether theirs is going to win or not. And just because I had these poker chips, which were worth nothing, they were just, you know, plastic pieces. Um, they worked on their consonants and vowels. And so, by giving them a little bit in those, the times where they're not being talked at, um, is oftentimes gets them to pay attention when they are doing the whole group. Because then you're like, okay, if we get through all this stuff that we're supposed to do, whole group and this direct instruction, we can break up into our centers and do these different activities to reinforce that. So, um, so it doesn't matter how old they are. When I do teacher training, they don't want to sit there for 12 hours listening to me babble. They want to get up and move around and do these activities too. So I have them up and down and playing the games and doing different things. Because we're all built that way. Different levels of, you know, how long we can sit and pay attention. But
Mm.
research shows one activity for more than, 10 to 15 minutes. If it's just visual auditory, you've lost them after, the first
Mm.
10.
Mhm.
Um, so if there's no engagement, then you're talking to yourself. So
Right.
all right. Well, I think are we done with most everything? All the questions or
I think so. Again, if just to as a reminder, our click is on Thursday. If you have more questions, if you want to get into maybe some more specifics or want to learn lots of ways to play with those games, I know Jennifer didn't plug it, but like all of the card decks, like Code Quest, there's 10 different ways to play with it, so you can kind of keep it a big variety. So if you have those questions, please come to the click. You can register on our online store. And thank you so much for joining us.
thank you very much. Have a great night.
Bye.
Bye.